Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be taking a look at The Living Mummy and Other Stories by Jack Davis. This is part of Fantagraphics EC library. I have mixed feelings about the EC stuff. Like, I like a lot of the artists. I usually really don't like the stories and the overuse of captions in them. But I picked up a bunch of these during the Fanabucks sale because I'm just pre-ordering everything I want for the year, and then having a bunch of free comics basically, which is awesome. And I definitely at least want to get the art in these. Jack Davis is someone whose art I've always enjoyed. This book's interesting because it's his earlier stuff, so you get to see him develop, and nothing really looks like what I associate, Jack Davis with. Like his, by the time he's at Mad and has his really distinct, they have a picture in here of a self-portrait that's like his style that you expect with the big, this thing with the skinny arms and the big feet and all of that, with all of the texture. Then this is quite different. It's obvious that he's very influenced by the other EC artists at this time, and Milt Caniff and artists like that. So this one, The Living Mummy, it says the first story he did. I'm assuming these are in chronological order because it kind of, I could see some progression towards his style throughout. But this really just looks like, a pretty decent version of what everyone else is doing, Graham Ingalls, and it's all kind of got that Milt Caniff, big, thick, brushy style. It's really interesting in these early stories to see that he pretty much is working exclusively with brush, as far as I can tell. Most of the marks look like brush, except for when he gets into some of the gnarlier texture. So I could see, and we'll show some of the pages when he really starts kicking into the pen and ink work. Like here, it looks like there's some pen and ink work going on to get the textures and the hair, and I quite like that a lot better. This kind of stuff here. He's always more successful when he's doing that, I think. So it's interesting to see him move more into that. This one, unlike Fall Guy for Murder, which I actually wound up really enjoying the stories and really enjoying actually how the captions were used. This one's totally written by Gaines and Feldstein all the way throughout, and I just don't think they're sophisticated writers. They're also just kind of dumb stories, in my opinion. Like, this is this guy thinking his brother is a werewolf, and he spends all this time, and he finally gets caught by the werewolf, and his brother saves him, and it's the chick the whole time along. I don't know. I'm just not into that type of story. And then you add all of these captions, which are pretty redundant in terms of explaining what's going on, and it's just what I don't like about the EC. This story, the conniver, is pretty weird. It's about an assistant editor at a comic company who's jealous of the bougie lifestyle of the editor-in-chief, and so he basically gaslights one of the artists into thinking that the editor-in-chief is fooling around with his wife, and he's going to use that. He's going to tip that artist over the edge to murder the editor-in-chief so he'll get a promotion, and his plan's happening, and he goes in and he drinks some of the editor-in-chief's wine, and the artists come in and is like, oh, I poisoned the wine. It's just a really strange story given, the kind of structure that we know EC was. It's like, what was going on in the offices that they wrote this story? So I don't know. They're just all weird like that and silly. This one is this guy. At this point, I had quit reading them. I was just seeing how much of the story I could pick up by looking at the art and maybe reading a couple captions here or there. This is someone who's been given a drink to melt into a jellyfish. So I like it when his art gets stranger. But at this point, he's really still struggling with faces in a lot of the panels, and the bodies are more stiff. The brushwork is kind of like Leonard Starrish, kind of Milt Caniffish, but it's just not all there yet. Then with this story, the basket, all of a sudden I see kind of Jack Davis showing up with his mark making style all throughout here. And now I can see that he's using a pen. He's using brush for all of the big, thick, juicy lines, and then using a pen for all of the gradients and the texture work. And then all of a sudden I really start to like the art. Also here there's a real nice, more like Will Eisner vibe to how he's rendering the clothes. The figures are starting to get more rubbery. Like in these earlier ones, he's definitely stiffer and aiming more towards not realism, but it's a more kind of stable proportions and stuff like this. Now he's starting to get that rubberiness that I associate with Jack Davis. So it's interesting to track those changes. And then by the next story, I'm seeing even more of that, even more of this type of pen rendering going throughout. It looks like he's actually using pen to draw some of the folds, and there's a lot of exaggeration on the figures. The hands are getting bigger and gnarlier. You can see right here there's a lot of rubberiness. So I don't know which artists he would have been looking at to switch. I'm assuming Kriegstein would have been one. I'm not a real expert on like the EC era artists. I'm more thinking about the strip artists. So I'm sure there was some guys that in the EC stable that he was picking stuff up from. You can obviously see like Wrightson. I don't know when Wrightson shows up, so I don't know if the influence goes forwards or backwards on that. But there's just more of that kind of brushwork as well. Then in this story here, the irony of death, you can really see the pen work kick in. Like pretty much this whole hand looks mostly rendered by pen. Even in the darks, you can see he's building up a lot of hatching to create the darks. Here it looks more like brushwork. And in here you can see a lot of this sharp pen work rendering the wrinkles in the clothes. So I think he gets a lot better once he switches over to the majority of pen. There's also a lot more sharpness in his rendering of things, like the way that the wrinkles will turn the corner. They happen very sharp instead of fluid like you would get with the brush. All kinds of hatching all over the place. So I really just see these last couple ones as the transition into like Jack Davis becoming Jack Davis. It's still not what I'm familiar with from Mad Magazine. I don't know if there was some ghosting going on or if he was just trying something else here entirely. But I mean, you have a much more like almost attempt at photorealism on these faces with a lot of extra hatching. They didn't have dates on the stories, so it's hard to compare to what else was out at the time. But I definitely start to see some of like how Stan Drake would do rendering. I don't know if he was looking at Stan Drake's work. There's also a lot of what I associate with like Neil Adams, the way Neil Adams does cross hatching that's not like this, but they're almost parallel to each other. That's showing up, and just the use of the pen in general has some Neil Adams. So I don't know if Ben Casey was out at that time and Jack Davis would have been looking at that, or if that goes vice versa. But just noticing similarities in approach. And then here again, you can see much heavier use of cross-hatching all over the place, much kind of stranger, sharper rendering going on in the folds and the fabrics a lot of the times. So that was the most interesting thing for me in this. I don't particularly, like I said, find the stories interesting. Now here with Cut, all of a sudden you get the rubberiness and the cartooniness of the structure underneath all of the rendering. Like this character is much more, curvy and cartoony on the rendering, but then you still have kind of the same pen techniques mixed with the brush techniques. I also think at this point he's working more half and half, like there looks like these big chunky marks slapped in with the brush, and then he's going back over top of that, or whichever order, I don't know, and rendering with the pen. But the figures look much more bendy, and here I can start to see the influence on Moebius. I know Moebius was really into Jack Davis, and I start to see in these characters how their hands are rendered, just the kind of curvature underneath their arms, faces like this, poses like this. I also noticed that the fluidity of the body language, like this sequence here, everything feels very much on the curves. The legs bow out and stuff, so they're very rubbery and alive in a way that they weren't in the earlier images. And you see him heading towards what he actually becomes there. And again, stuff like this, I think you can really see the influence on Moebius, especially early Moebius. So that kind of sticks for a while. It's like he falls into that style more steadily. I noticed some images like this where he's more horrific really feels more particular to him. Something like this even reminds me of what Barry Windsor Smith just did a couple years ago, well, I guess over the last 30 years, but with his book Monsters. So I'm seeing like this type of hatching and the volumetric rendering, the hatching going over like in a cross contour, also building up texture. There's a lot of that going on in this later stuff, which is really beautiful and really interesting to me. His brushwork works on images like this because it's really chaotic and it's not rendering anything specific, but he's never quite really good at rendering clothing. Like this is a panel that's a really good example right here with the wrinkles in the jacket, like in the arm. They're totally random. They make no sense. The only thing I could think of when I was looking at this is like how the guys from Image drew the veins and necks from, like you have Dale Keown and Mark Silvestri and Liefeld, all those, they just drew Image necks. They were just random set of marks trying to make things look like light and dark, but they didn't map onto anything. That's how a lot of his drapery looks, especially around the arms and the shoulders where everything bunches up. I've never found anything in this book where it actually seems like he has a real understanding of how drapery moves. It's just, I know it makes a bunch of wrinkles, and so I'm going to slap a bunch of shit on there. And that's always done with the brush, too, so it gets really kind of funky and piled up in a gross way, whereas Milt Caniff could slap all that stuff in there and it would make sense, but here it's just all so random. When he does it with the pen, it seems like he has more control and there's a little bit more sense to what's going on, like he's slowing down and drawing a little bit more, like up in this area, but down in here he's still just slapping shit all over the place. The only story that I found interesting at all, and again, I started not really reading them, so there could have been better ones in there, I don't know, but this one caught my attention just because of the structure of it, where they're doing what's called a EC Quickie, but they're putting two EC Quickies back to back to basically retell the same story with a different outcome. So in the first one, the husband who's being cheated on, his best friend's cheating, like sleeping with his wife behind his back, takes him out and has a hunting accident, and then of course it goes awry and hurts him as well. And then this one, you basically pick up the same story, but now it's that the friend who's sleeping with the guy's wife is gonna murder him, and then also does himself dirty by shooting the guy and then putting holes in the boat. And I guess he doesn't know how to swim because he drowns. So that one, I just like the idea of using two, like if people had gotten familiar to this quickie thing, then they're thinking they're getting one story, and then you give them two back to back with different endings. That's kind of fun. And then really liked the strange art right here where these guys, I guess, have gotten flattened by a steamroller, and this is his attempt to draw people flattened by a steamroller. There's still too much like volumetric information in here for them to look totally flat, so it winds up looking like a weird House of Mirrors type of mirror distortion. But I quite like the art in there, and it lets him be a little bit sharper. I think he's quite a bit better when his work's a little bit sharper. The structure underneath being rubbery is always very good, but when his line work is a little bit more crisp and sharp, I think it works. It looks more intentional. So I don't know. That's about as much as I could get out of this, was just kind of tracking those things in the art. I wish I knew more about all the other artists that he would have been exposed to, like where this all sits in the timeline. That could have been more interesting to me. But I'm also not the type of person who's so interested in that I'm going to go out and research it after the fact. I'll just notice similarities here and there, and I don't really care which way the influence went. But it's interesting to see someone who has such a well-defined style, in my mind. It's interesting to see their early work headed towards that, but never quite getting there yet. That was fun. This one, since I just happened to flip to it, I thought was some really actually pretty bad drawing, pretty bad inking at least, where this guy's supposed to be sitting here sneering, but it's really hard to tell exactly if he's sneering or if he's got a mustache and a weird lip. That just did not read well at all. I was looking at it, trying to figure it out without going to the captions, and then I had to go to the captions to try and make sense of it. So that it's just bad drawing, because the captions really aren't giving much information in these, and I think that's to the detriment of most of the EC stuff. Is they just have that old style of writing where the captions are pretty redundant. That's the thing I really liked about the Fall Guy for Murder, is that the captions actually were pretty informative, and they they worked with the art to co-inform rather than just reinforce. So I'll be curious to see if there's any other good writing and good use of captions in any of the other EC library books I have or not, but at least I'm excited to look at the artists and track their stuff.
Like and subscribe and hit the bell, please, so Carson can finish reading his books and let me go home.